Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you again. Thank you for joining me once more for our online course on managing child behaviour. You've done well to be here. We had a week off last week, and that's probably thrown some people. I suspect you all have done very well to return again for another session. Or if this is your first session, that's also fine. We're up to session number 3 in our online course, where we're using functional assessment to tackle tantrums in particular. Now, I'm joining you through the magic of the internet, of course. If you've been here before, you're probably fairly familiar with the way this works. You're going to hear me talking to you. You're going to see some images on the screen. You're going to see me for some of the time. You've also got the opportunity to interact a bit. There is a chat box over on the left side of your screen or your mobile device in most cases if you're lucky and it's working properly. We've also got the lovely Kim facilitating with us tonight, so you'll see her talking to you as well in the chat room. She works with me here at the Parenting Research Centre. Otherwise, you can feel free to talk to each other. We'll also run some polls and do some other types of activities throughout the session. But bear in mind that everyone here is a real person, so we need to be kind of sensitive to each other and how we're interacting with each other. Feel free to ask questions as we go through the session. I'll mainly be paying attention to them towards the end, so don't forget any questions that are burning topics for you. Write them down or something so you don't forget, and I'll get to most of them towards the end, hopefully. I'll check in with you throughout as well, though. So these sessions are brought to you by Raising Children Network and the Parenting Research Centre with funding from the Victorian state government, but of course you might be joining us from all around Australia. And on that note, I'd like to do a couple of acknowledgements. One is to the Victorian Government Department of Education and Training for funding, which is why we can bring this service to you for free, regardless of where you are around Australia. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting tonight. I don't know if cyberspace has traditional owners, but in terms of land around Australia, in Melbourne where I am here, it's the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional owners of this land. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people we may have joining us today. Let's move on and see what we're going to actually be tackling tonight. I think before we do that, I'll just mention that if you are concerned or upset about anything we talk about tonight, you should, of course, seek your own individualized support. The best I can do for you is give you some generalized advice. I can't do a whole lot for you in terms of your particular circumstances or helping you out if you're really struggling. Do check out something like a GP or a psychologist in your area, or try some of these free support services that we've got listed on the screen. That's really important. Tantrums are stressful. They do have an impact on people, and don't feel bad or hesitate to seek support if you need it. Now, this is a course. If you're new, I hope you realize that. If not, that's okay, because you've got a chance to catch up. I'm going to do a little recap at the start of the session, but I really recommend, if this is your first session, go back and watch the recordings, which will come around via email, because we have covered a lot of content already, as I'm sure those of you who are here can attest. We're cramming a lot into this course. It's usually much longer, but we've cut it down and crammed a lot in. Let's just have a look, see that we're all on the same page about where we're up to, what comes next, and how it all fits together. Session 1 we've completed. That was a level unto itself. It was an overview of sort of why tantrums happen and this approach to dealing with them. Level 2 has 3 sessions in it. That's where we're up to now. It covers, again, a thorough treatment of the functional assessment approach, but with more kind of guidance on how to use it. And then the final session has another 3 final level, has another 3 sessions, which goes into more depth, kind of special topics in dealing with tantrums, and covering some stuff that you really need to know to do this effectively. We've covered by now the first 2 of those sessions, which are ticked off there. That's really excellent. And the exciting thing is now you're starting to amass some knowledge that you can start applying and should hopefully be starting to make a little bit of a difference if you persist with it. Of course, don't rely on these webinars being the only thing you do about managing tantrums. You listening to me isn't going to make much difference to your child. That's really where it comes down to you actively trying to do something new during the week with your child at home. So make sure you're doing some homework and following up on this approach. Use those handouts that we send around. I hope they're useful. So that's where we're up to. And here's a way of, I'm trying to summarize with this image what I'm hoping you might have taken away from the first two sessions. Or if you haven't taken away anything because it's washed over you because there was a heck of a lot of information, now's a chance to try and take this stuff in. So here's what I think is maybe a realistic frame for what you might be doing so far. And I'm going to go through this in terms of things you might understand or ways of thinking about tantrums, and also a few things you might actually be doing in the real world. So remember how we've talked about situations? We went through that analysis of thinking about who's there, when it's happening, what's going on at the time, any other circumstances around it. If your child's tired, hungry, we built up our whole theory of child behavior and why tantrums happen. And we've also covered, building on from that, working out the purpose of the behavior, which is the real strength of the functional assessment approach, because that lets you target the purpose to be more effective in what you're trying to do. So situations and purpose, two key ideas. Then we talked about triggers. Remember that word? We covered that last session. That was one of the key words that we're going to come back to again and again. And we had some ideas about modifying triggers. Again, if this isn't ringing a bell, go back to the recording from last session or have a look over the notes. Of course, it's a concept we'll come back to again. And we also looked at consequences, what happens right after the tantrum, and how that can play a role in the tantrum behavior, and how you can change it to influence the tantrum behavior. And next we had ways you can target the purpose, trying to help your child with the purpose in a way of getting around the tantrum so that the tantrum doesn't need to happen. If the purpose can be met by a better behavior, a more acceptable behavior, then there may not need to be a tantrum anymore. And then three things that you might try and be doing already at home, or if you're not, have a go at these. One, catch them being good. Instead of always talking about, well, instead of tending to get caught up with the difficult behavior that you want to stop, make sure you're spending some extra attention to purposefully pick out good or at least neutral behavior that your child does, and think creatively about that. Set yourself a goal of at least 5 times a day you're going to say, hey, good job sitting still, good job putting your shoes on, whatever it is that your child can do. You also might try working on directing them towards replacement behavior. We talked about some ways you can choose replacement behaviors. We're going to fine-tune that as we go along, but that's something I hope you can start putting into practice now. Think of a replacement behavior, guide your child towards that when they're having a tantrum or in the lead up to a tantrum. And finally, intervene earlier in the behavior chain. That was an idea we introduced, I think, towards the end of last session. So it might be fairly recent for you. But the idea is if we track the triggers or the sequence of causes over time that led to the tantrum, we track them back, we might be able to get in earlier and stop the tantrum from happening in the first place. So if you know that a lot of the tantrums happen when your child's hungry, maybe you get in earlier with offering them something to eat or trying to get them to eat so that that isn't leading into the tantrum behavior and contributing in that way. So that slide's probably one that you can return to at the end of the session if you want to jog your memory of where we're up to and what you can be doing at the moment to try and get the most out of this process. On that note, we're going to do a little poll here to get you guys thinking. Why don't I turn my video off for a second? I haven't gone away. I've turned off my video on purpose. Don't panic, folks. What I'm interested in is, can you we've already done this, but let's try again. I'm interested in what you think the purpose is at this stage of your child's tantrums. So that will now come up on the screen, fingers crossed, and I want you to click which option you think is the purpose of your child's tantrums. It could be to get attention, avoid attention, get an activity, avoid an activity, get a sensation, or avoid a sensation. If you can't quite remember what these were, or you haven't heard this before, that's okay, have a guess. The descriptions probably mean something to you just from reading it. The idea is there are three kind of categories which kids are either trying to get closer to or avoid that can explain tantrums. This is a neat way of dividing it up so that we can target our efforts more closely. And you can choose more than one of these, by the way. So far it's neck and neck between get attention and get activity. Get activity just pulling ahead. Oh no, it's equal now. I'll stop the poll in a second. We've also got lots of good votes for avoid activity and get sensation. No one yet for avoid sensation or avoid attention. All right, I might end the poll there. Avoid sensation and avoid attention are particularly relevant if you have a child with additional needs. Think about that if you particularly have got a child with an autism spectrum disorder, other kinds of developmental concerns, because it's not always obvious that that's what's going on. Their behavior can seem strange until you purposefully think through, right, why are they having a tantrum in this situation? It might be something that you can't see, like they really don't like the sensation of some clothes that they're wearing or some noise around them, or they're trying to avoid someone getting too close to them and talking to them. So thanks for your participation there, folks. Lots of people along the lines of getting attention and getting activity, which makes sense to me. Those are very common ones. Now, in today's webinar, we're going to be adding more to this. It's not as content heavy as the last two, which is good news. Hopefully we'll have a bit more time for questions and we can move not quite as quickly, I think. One of the main aims for today's session is I want to kind of expand your attention. We've really alluded to this already, but not gone into it in a whole lot of detail. What we're going to aim to do is build up a sort of a map of your child's tantrums and how they fit into the context of your family. Context is really everything in functional assessment. You've noticed already we've been talking about what happens around the tantrum and what happens just before it in time, what happens just after it in time. So this is a really important concept. I've just got this little pirate treasure map on the screen as a way of trying to visualize this and check that we're all on the same page. Often when you start out trying to deal with tantrums, we've got this attitude of we just want to get rid of the tantrums. So all we think about is the tantrums. What do we do about tantrums? And in the end, we put them on a little island, like up on the top left here. I'm trying to outline that. There you go, with my squiggly outline. We think of tantrums on a little island and we think, can't we just section off Tantrum Island or get rid of it or bomb it or something so that we don't have to deal with it anymore? Unfortunately, it tends not to be that easy, and we end up having to think about a whole lot of other stuff as well that we weren't really planning on getting into. So that approach tends not to be effective. Instead, we have to think about all sorts of other things, which just came up on the mainland here of our approach to dealing with tantrums. We have to think about things like socialization, things like sharing, things like what happens when siblings are involved, what happens when we get in the car, what happens at meal times when we're expecting them to eat or when they're tired or when they want attention. Now, your map will look different based on your family, but I just want you to start thinking about some of these hot topics. What are the pressure points in your family or for your child that tend to lead to tantrums? Because that's really the gold mine in trying to change this behavior. Don't get tunnel vision focused on the tantrum itself. And so we can identify, all right, there's some hot spots, maybe here and here and here that really seem to be causing problems for us. Some people are having problems with dropping in and out. Unfortunately, that tends to happen when we're trying to do multimedia stuff over the internet. You can try refreshing your browser or fiddling around with your internet connection. But if it's coming through at all, it's probably something to do with bandwidth maybe at your end. So let's keep going. We're going to keep building on this idea of mapping behavior in this session, all right? I'm going to give you some ideas on how to do that with your child. We're going to talk about how you can identify those pressure points so that you're being really effective in targeting the sort of problem areas. We're going to talk about setting goals so that you've got some idea of where you're heading and how you're going to know when you're getting there. We're going to talk about charting our progress. I'm really taking this analogy to the extreme here, but how you know whether you're on the right track. We're not just going to launch off in any direction and hope that we get to our destination. And we're going to talk about managing the journey along the way, how you deal with everything that you've got to do in order to be effective. So there's a bit to cover, but none of these topics are too huge. Don't feel daunted by that. You've been through much worse ordeals with me already. Let's just say that much. So let's talk about mapping behavior to start off with. And we're going to return to this idea of the telephone test. Do people remember this idea? We introduced it very briefly, I think in session number 1. It's kind of a neat idea, and that's for 2 reasons. The telephone test just means that when you're trying to describe behavior, we want you to be very specific about it. And the way to do that is to imagine yourself describing it to someone on the other end of the phone. So if I called up Kim and said, was trying to tell her what my child did and the problems I was having with tantrums, to pass the telephone test, I'd have to be specific with my language so that she can form a picture in her mind of just what went on. So if I say my child had a tantrum today and it was the worst, Kim's not really going to know exactly what I mean by that. But she'd probably commiserate anyway. So the 2 reasons the telephone test is really useful to you is 1, it's going to help you communicate about behavior better, which is always valuable because I bet there are other people involved somehow. Whether they be your significant other, whether they be other children, other relatives, maybe teachers at school, early childhood services, anyone who's involved with your child. At some point you might need to communicate with them about this behavior. And the telephone test is also useful in guiding how you think about behavior. If you're thinking about behavior in general terms, like what is the deal with this tantrum, it's over the top, I can't deal with it, it's going to affect how you respond. If you can be kind of almost a little bit clinical and precise in your terminology or the words you use in your own mind, it's going to help you be effective in using a particular response that you've planned ahead of time. So why don't we have a go at this? We're going to do a bit of a game here so that we can test your understanding, all right, folks? I'm going to read out some descriptions and then I'm going to put a poll on the screen and you tell me if you think it passes the telephone test or not. I'm going to put the poll up, but don't answer yet or I'll know you're cheating. So the poll's up, but wait for me to read the description, then you tell me if it passes the telephone test. Let's go. First one. These are quite tricky, all right, so you'll have to pay attention. First one. Sam was such a good boy. He did everything I asked and didn't complain once. That's the description. Do you think that passes the telephone test? Can you form a picture in your mind of exactly what happened there? Or are you kind of scratching your head saying, well, I don't really know exactly what was involved there? Excellent. Lots of people giving responses so far. Give you 3, 2, 1, no more seconds. Oh, some quick answers at the end there. All right, so we had 18 to 3. 86% of you in favor of no, that doesn't pass the telephone test. I think that's a pretty good answer, folks. I would tend to agree with that. Sam was such a good boy, he did everything I asked. I want to know, what was it that he did? Were you asking him to do something simple like pick up a piece of paper from the floor, or were you asking him to paint the Mona Lisa? Big difference, isn't there, depending on what the task was. Let's do another one or two of these just to make sure that we're on the same page. All right, so I'll bring the poll up again and then I'll read the description and then you can vote. So here's the description. Sam put all of the Lego that he'd been playing with back in its box and put it on the shelf in his room after one reminder. Do you think that passed the telephone test? Can you form a picture in your mind of exactly what happened in that situation? Lots of people voting on this one already. Quick on the buzzers. Good to see, very impressive. I'll give you another 3, 2, 1. Oh, one vote for no right on the finish line. We've got 96% of you think yes, that does pass the telephone test. Of course, there's always some grey area here, isn't there? You can always ask for more detail, so fair enough to say no. This is definitely better than the first one though, isn't it? You can kind of form a picture. Yeah, I know what that looks like, picking up Lego, putting it back on the shelf. Oh, one reminder, okay, that's giving me an idea of how that child was responding to instructions. So definitely much better. Let's look at another interesting one. No, let's go back to this one. So one more. I'll put the poll up and then read the description. So there's the poll. Here's the description. Put your thinking hats on. Sam helped his sister with her homework and they got along well. Does that pass the telephone test? Can you form a picture in your mind of what was happening? Do you need more information? Responses coming in thick and fast. Very good. Fiona's having a lot of technical difficulties. I'm sorry about that, Fiona. Hopefully the recording will work for you better. Nearly everyone's responded, I think. Excellent. We've got 76% in favor of no. Andrew, you added some clarification. You think it's vague but sums up a basic activity. I agree. I think it would be nice to have a bit more information, wouldn't it, in terms of how Sam was helping or what getting along well means. But you can probably form a bit of an idea. It would be nice to know a bit more, wouldn't it, just about how challenging that situation was, or how long it lasted maybe, or a bit more about what was involved. But good responses there, folks. Let's move along. Thank you for participating in that activity. I hope that was helpful to break it up a bit. Now, I hope this shows up okay on your screens. Next, what we want to do is we're going to have a bit of a chat about how you can quantify behavior. Because if you're going to map behavior properly, one part of it is kind of how big those islands are on our map that we were thinking about earlier, or how the extent of any particular behavior. So we're going to do a little bit of theory now about measuring behavior. That's all quantifying is. And there's a few different ways you can do this, which are on the screen now. The first one is frequency. It's just how often that behavior happens. The second one is duration, how long it lasts for. Does it last for, does your child have a 5-minute tantrum, or a 1-hour tantrum, or a 2-hour tantrum, or God forbid longer. And the final one is permanent products. It's a bit of a fancy term for basically what the outcome is. So a broken vase, or you know, things knocked over, amount of mess made, or for good behavior it might be things like toys shared, or good manners used, friendly words, something like that. So let's go through how some of these might work. And I might take myself off the screen again. The reason we want to measure behavior is so that we can track it over time. That way you're going to get a really precise map of what's going on. So we don't need to get overly fussy about tracking behavior. The main idea is that we've got to be pragmatic, and we just want you to have a system that works for you. But here are some options just to get you thinking. The first option that you could consider is something called a behaviour diary, right? So this is a way of keeping track of your child's tantrums. And here's an example of what it looks like. What you do with the behaviour diary is you have a column for the date when the behaviour happened, a description of the behaviour, and you will have some stuff about what was happening before, what happened after, maybe any other comments that you have, maybe who was there, or anything else that you think might be important. A little pop quiz for you. Anyone have any ideas? If I say what happened before, what have we called that last session? What's our functional assessment name for what happens just before a tantrum and contributes to it happening? Any clever cookies remember what that term is? The name for what happens just before a behavior? Oh, you're good, folks. It's the trigger. Andrew, Caroline, Laura, Samantha, Lauren, Melissa, all very on the ball. Thank you. Don't worry if that didn't come to you straight away. We've only covered it very briefly so far. So this behavior is about Braden and when he's hitting, but you could just as easily do this for tantrums. So this is a good idea. It's very informative. As a psychologist, I love this kind of thing because it gives you lots of fantastic information that you can work out lots of things from. One drawback is it takes a bit of effort to complete this and a bit of time. You've got to remember to write stuff down and fill in some extra details. So the risk here is that it might be more than you can keep up with if it doesn't suit your lifestyle. So don't take on something that it's a bit of a hard ask for you. We want you to choose something that you can maintain for a good while. So it's a great option if you reckon you can manage it. Caroline, you looked at your notes. Cheater. How dare you? I forgive you. It's good to review anyway, isn't it? Another option that you might want to consider for mapping behavior is a simple tally. You might have used this before for any sorts of things. It's just you make a little mark every time the behavior happens. So maybe you get a piece of lined paper, have a line to a day, something like that. Just put a little mark there every time a tantrum happens, and you'll get a sense of where the tantrums are worst and where they weren't so bad. That one's pretty simple. Reasonably easy to maintain as well. You can stick a bit of paper on the fridge or, you know, make a note in your phone, something like that. Let's check out another idea. Here's a bit of a fancier tally set out in a table where it's got some dates as well, and it's got ticks and crosses for where the requests are complied with. So that's for a different kind of behavior, but just to give you some more ideas. Next one's called an interval record. This is a way of measuring the duration of the behavior, which can be a good idea with tantrums. If you're particularly concerned that your child seems to be having really long tantrums that you can't seem to get them out of, and everyone's getting worn out, like that's something that's really concerning you. For an interval record, all we've got here is up the top, we've got the dates going across, and then down the side we've got time, and you just colour in one of the little boxes whenever a tantrum happens. So if it goes for an hour, you might colour in 2 of those half-hour boxes, or another one if it goes for an hour and a half. And that way over time you can look at the pattern and think, all right, are the tantrums getting longer or shorter? So that's the interval record. Penelope, you have an excellent question about how would you track behavior if your child's in daycare? Can you track while they're there? Depends how, obviously, if you're not there, you can't track it yourself. Depends on how cooperative and enthusiastic your early childhood staff are. Some of them might be willing to work with you and keep track of the behavior using whatever system you like, because they might be concerned about the tantrums too and be prepared to put some effort into it. Otherwise, you might just have to restrict your efforts to at home. So you can treat them as separate situations and say, all right, let's start by focusing on when the tantrums happen at home and keep track of those ourselves. That would be good progress in itself. But that is a challenge, isn't it? Getting everyone on the same page. Then once we've got all this good data, you've been collecting it for a while, the next step is analysis. Now, I'm going to take you back to high school for a bit here. Actually, that's going to be the next section. But the idea is you want to, in some way, look at these data. Don't just let them pile up for weeks and weeks and weeks. You want to have a look at the data and think, all right, what can I tell from this? Are tantrums getting better or worse? And when were they getting worse? Was it worse when they were on school holidays or when were they at school? Was it worse when Auntie Jo came to visit or when she left? Next topic we're going to deal with is identifying those pressure points. Now, remember, in this session I'm going to try and get you to expand your attention to looking broader than just the tantrum itself. And part of that is looking beyond just the child having the tantrum. So here's a child who we might be concerned about, wondering, right, what's going on with their tantrums? We've already talked, though, about who else is involved in the tantrums. Not that it's their fault, but it's worth thinking about who else is there and how is the child reacting to them. Well, if you're a parent of a child, you might already be on board with the idea that they could be reacting to you in some way. So that's worth thinking about, or any other adults in the situation. Could also be a sibling maybe that they're reacting to. So think about, all right, when my child's having a tantrum, what was their brother or sister doing in the lead up or at the time? Is that relevant? Are they struggling with sharing or with their role in the family? Similarly, maybe other relatives, think about how they react, and this is not just to do with tantrums, but how they react to that relative in general. And of course, we need to think about other people as well. Could be teachers, childcare workers, other sorts of carers, cousins, distant family members, friends. And we also need to think about expanding our attention beyond just the tantrum to other things that your child does. So if we just think about, all right, when your child looks like this, we might be missing out on a whole lot of useful information about all the other things that they do. So for example, if your child spends a lot of, or is not doing a lot of engaging in other activities, that's relevant to you. So think about all the other kinds of things that they're doing, maybe compliance as well, maybe how they're socializing with other kids. All of this is going to feed into remember our theory of why tantrums happen. It's to do with trying to deal with the world around them and getting frustrated and overwhelmed. So think about how they're going dealing with the world around them. It's a bit theoretical, isn't it? But I think it's really important that we have that mindset. Also, to make sure that you're targeting, this can be the right pressure points. Think about what makes the tantrum a problem. Now, it's easy to just say, well, it's a tantrum. Of course it's a problem. But if I challenge you to be more specific, I can say, all right, but why is that a problem for you? Like, is it the noise that it creates? Is it the fact that they're not doing what they need to? Is it that they're interrupting other children or other family members? Is it that they're hitting and being violent? Is it that they're breaking things? All of those are worth being specific about, and also differentiate from things that aren't really causing you a problem, like the child being upset or crying or being sad or being moody. All of that is kind of more their problem than yours. So make sure that we're targeting stuff that is actually a problem for you and the family and people around them, because you'll be much more successful that way. So we want to plan ahead, just like Godzilla here for his invasion of Japan, so that we have a particular strategy for what to do and when. Now, I know I haven't really told you exactly how to do that yet. That's partly this session, but also going to be a lot more focused on in next session, session number 4, when we're going to go into much more detail about consequences, how to respond in the moment. But basically, at this stage, I really want you to be doing some planning. All right, I've done some thorough thinking about my child's different sorts of behavior, how they respond to different people, what in particular about the tantrum is making it a problem for me, and ways that I can target that with replacement behavior and some of the other strategies we've already covered. And also think about the kind of situations that really affect you. So if you've got certain tantrum situations that kind of make you want to hide, or just that seem really hard to deal with, maybe don't make them the first ones that you tackle. We want to sort of get some runs on the board here. So it's a good idea to think about, all right, where's the sort of not too challenging area that we can target first, get some positive behavior happening, and then deal with these situations that are really scaring you and seem like, I don't know how we're going to deal with that. All right, just a couple of notes on setting goals for dealing with tantrums. Basically, remember this principle. Our whole idea with functional assessment is we want to get more replacement behavior happening so that less difficult behavior can occur. And the way we do that is through ensuring that the replacement behavior has desirable consequences and the difficult behavior doesn't. All right, so that's our goal. We want to be reinforcing replacement behavior. Some notes on replacement behavior. We've covered this briefly in session 1, I think. But just to review, this is in rank order. So when you're choosing a replacement behavior, number 1 is the best. That would be something acceptable that will achieve the same purpose for your child. So remember, once you've identified the purpose, one of those 6, if you can think of something that they can do that will achieve the same purpose, that is super powerful, because then they don't really need to have the tantrum as much. All right? That's not always possible. Suppose the purpose is not acceptable, like they want to have ice cream for dinner every night. It's not really anything they can do that's going to lead to them getting that outcome, because you're not going to allow it, probably. Then you would move on to, all right, can we choose something in line with number 2 here? Something your child could do that is opposite or incompatible with the behavior. So that would be, instead of, no, don't think about the tantrum itself here maybe. Think about the trigger, like snatching a toy from a brother or sister. The replacement behavior could be offering a toy to a brother or sister, right? So they can't be doing both at once. And so that's an incompatible behavior. If you can't think of anything like that, just think of something generally positive or acceptable that you could encourage instead. Like talking is a good one if your child has those verbal skills. It's not always possible though. Things like moving to a different room, putting down what they're holding, you know, saying something nice to someone else, giving someone a hug, naming colors, anything that you like that's just generally something to do that you can get them to try and focus on instead of whatever's upsetting them or frustrating them. That one's kind of like deflection or diversion. You also want to make sure that your replacement behavior has these features. So first of all, it's got to be doable. You don't want to choose a replacement behavior that's too hard so that your child's actually struggling to do the replacement behavior if they even want to. So you wouldn't choose something that requires something that they're not really strong enough to do, or that they have to sit still for a really long time if they're young and that's hard for them to do. You want it to be something that's pretty easy for them to do by choice. So the challenge is just really whether they choose to do it or not. And also think about your child's developmental stage. So if they have a delay or a disability or a developmental challenge of some sort, you need to bear that in mind. So if you have a child who doesn't have the greatest language skills, don't set them a replacement behavior that requires talking. Or if they don't have good fine motor skills, don't choose drawing or something fiddly. It also needs to be measurable. We've talked about measurement so far for tantrums. You want to apply the same ideas to replacement behavior, right? It needs to be something that you could measure. You don't have to measure it, but it needs to be something that you could measure. So don't make it so vague that you can't really tell whether it's happened. It also needs to be something that they can do fairly often. So if it's like, say, happy birthday to their grandma, that's not very repeatable, is it? Because they can only do it once a year because the grandma only has a birthday once a year. So there's not going to be much opportunity for reinforcing that replacement behavior. Instead, choose something that they could easily do several times a day, which shouldn't be too hard to achieve. So there's some ideas for setting goals around replacement behavior. Now, charting our progress. This is where I'm going to take you back to high school, and we're going to do some graphing. Goody, isn't that exciting, folks, for a Tuesday night at 8:45. The idea with graphing is I don't want to overcomplicate it, and this is one that, frankly, it's pretty hard to get people to do. If you can, you'll probably find it makes a difference, though. All we've got here is simply number of tantrums happening on the left side. You will have got that from your tally or behaviour diary or interval record, something like that. And you've got each week along the bottom there, and you just put the number on the graph in the right spot. Then you're going to be able to notice a pattern there. So let me just draw on this for a sec. So can you see how we're kind of wiggling up and down there? So there's some interesting things here, isn't there? What about up here? We've got a lot of tantrums there. We might ask a question about that along the lines of, what happened? Was it something like you implemented your reward chart, which got the tantrums down there? Or maybe grandma was visiting over here, which made your child more docile because they're happy to have someone else around? Was there a new replacement behavior introduced over here? So you can do a whole lot of thinking about what was going on at the time. So you can tell that I'm really trying to get you to think about focusing in and targeting, not being too general about what's going on in your child's tantrum. So that was all that I wanted to say about charting the progress. Just do some sort of chart. If you don't like graphs, try and overcome your aversion if you can, but otherwise at least look at what data you've got and try and make sense of it and talk to someone about what you think you've got going on there. Finally, I want to talk about managing the journey, which is kind of about you as a parent. So here we've got a young person learning to do the splits, a gymnast. Clearly that takes a lot of skill. We wouldn't expect a child to be able to do the splits just because we want them to. There'd have to be a lot of practice involved, right? I might bring myself back on the screen while I'm talking about this, just so you're not staring at a still image. We wouldn't expect them to be able to do that instantly. Just like when we're building up replacement behavior, we wouldn't expect them to be able to do that instantly either, just because we think they should. Just like learning to do the splits or some other skill like that, this takes time and effort for your child, so we need to be patient. Similarly, you're actually trying to do something different here as well, aren't you? You're trying to do things like encouraging replacement behaviors, catching them being good, intervening earlier in the behavior chain. Those were the three we covered at the start of the session. That's not as easy as it sounds. Well, I'm kind of putting some demands on you here and asking for extra patience from you, extra effort, extra time. The reason I bring that up is to be patient with yourself as well. You're going through a learning process and you're trying to change habits, which is not easy to do. Changing any habit takes a lot of effort. So be patient with yourself and with this process and with anyone else that's engaged in the process. Don't expect them to do it instantly either. And adopt what we call a growth mindset. It's a good idea. You might have heard of that in education. It's a very hot topic at the moment. The idea is just we don't focus on what we can't do or what we're not achieving yet. We focus on how we're going to get to where we want to be in the next stage. So we would say we're not doing that yet, but there's still the opportunity to do the thing that we're aiming to do. So don't get too frustrated if you can't get it happening the way you'd hoped right right from the start. You're only human. And also be mindful of your own stress levels. Tantrums are stressful, and for most of us anyway. In fact, I don't think I've ever come across a case of a parent seeking support around managing tantrums where they weren't stressed out about it or affected by it in some way. So it's really important that you don't, feel guilty about that, or you're not too hard on yourself about how you're managing the tantrum. And also make sure you look after yourself. It's entirely appropriate or acceptable and fine if your child's having a huge tantrum for an hour for you to take 2 or 5 minutes out to go into another room, close the door, and calm down however you need to do that. Put earmuffs on or something. Your child's going to probably escalate a whole lot more. That's okay. It's not going to do lasting harm to them. Of course, provided they're actually safe. Don't leave them in a room with lots of dangerous stuff while you're not actually there. And make sure you're in earshot. Basically, I'm saying if you've heard of the old idea of you get on an airplane and they say if the air masks come down from the ceiling, put your own on first before helping anyone else, because you can't help anyone if you're already unconscious. Same idea happens here. If you're overwhelmed and not feeling confident about the situation, you're not going to be able to respond the way you want to your child, or it's going to make it a lot harder to do that. So feel empowered, basically, to look after yourself first and foremost in the situation, and then respond in the way you want to your child's tantrum. Now, that brings us to the end of tonight's proceedings, nearly. It's the end of the content. Just a reminder about the feedback survey that Kim has been dutifully sharing in the chat. If you can stick around for the question time till the end, that will open automatically in your browser when I end the session. Otherwise, if you have to go, we'd appreciate your feedback by following the link on your way out. We do a new one of these each week, in case you're wondering why we keep bringing it up. So if you've done it before, we'd still be very grateful for your feedback each week, because each session is a new session. We want to know, did this one work better than the last? Were there new issues that we didn't encounter last week? So just a reminder that survey is happening again. I've got this recap of the 5 practical tips that I'm going to bring up on the screen again during question time. So that's going to be there while we're talking. We might refer to that. Reminder about if you're concerned or upset, don't be too complacent about that. If you're starting to get really worried or stressed, or you're not concerned that if you are concerned that you're not coping so well, seek some extra support. There's some options there on the screen, or seek someone in your local area that you can talk to. Even a trusted friend can be really valuable. Don't just bottle it all up. And a reminder that next session, you're not going to want to miss it. It's going to be pretty exciting. It's a pretty good session, if I do say so myself. It's all about responding to your child's behavior within the functional assessment framework. So don't get excited about, Tony's going to tell you the magic phrase to snap your child out of it. That's not going to happen. It's still going to be very purposeful and systematic, but that's going to be a really useful session, I think. And by the end of that session, you'll feel like you've got some really good ideas. And of course, as always, recording and handout will come around via email. If you're doing those activities at home, it's going to make a big difference. If you're not, you probably want to start pretty soon, because if you wait till the end of the course, I ain't going to be around to answer any questions you've got as they come along. It's one of the reasons we're doing this throughout, so that you can come back with your questions and say what's working and what's not. So it's nearly time to go, but we're going to stick around for 10 minutes of question time. I can see people are rolling in with some questions so far. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop talking for about a minute or something while I read some of the questions. I've not disappeared. Just stare out the window or something while I'm reading the questions, and then I'll start. All right, folks, feel free to keep your questions rolling in. We've got less people than we had last time, so you've got more opportunity, and we can spend a bit more time on each question if you like. So it's a good, take advantage if you like, or just sit back and have a listen. Gemma had a question about, can I explain the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown? Because you're concerned, Gemma, that your son is experiencing more than just normal toddler tantrums. We had a question a bit like that before. I forget exactly what the wording was. And my response was along these lines, that really any amount of tantrum is to some extent normal, right? That tantrums on their own, we don't usually use as a criteria for indicating some more severe concern. Having said that, there is an association between tantrums and other challenges. So things like developmental problems like intellectual disability, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and sometimes autism spectrum disorders can contribute to more frequency, more duration, or more intensity of tantrums. But that on its own isn't really an indicator that something else is going on. So what I would say is, do you have, kind of think about if you have other concerns about your child as well. Do they seem to be struggling in other ways? And of course, if you're concerned, you're really going to need an assessment by someone who can actually talk to you in person and your child and help you work out what's going on. You could start with your GP, maternal or child health nurse. They'll be able to give you some more ideas on that front. But really, even normally developing children with no particular issues besides tantrums can have really very severe tantrums. And there's just, but also some kids just have none. So there's just this quite a lot of variation within the normal population. Melissa, you've got a question about, is it normal for a child to hurt herself out of frustration during a tantrum? That can happen. Yes, that's not unheard of in tantrums. Things like hitting themselves, biting themselves, sort of knocking their heads on things, on the walls, running into things. It's not all that uncommon in tantrums, and I appreciate that it can be very concerning when you see it. So yes, that can be a normal part of tantrum behavior. Of course, you want to try and stop that from happening. So it is fine to hold your child to the extent that you need to stop them from hurting themselves, if you can. So if they're hitting themselves, you can hold their hand to stop them from doing that if you're worried about damage that they might be doing. But yes, that you've hit the nail on the head there when you mentioned frustration, and so that can lead to those kind of behaviors. We had some other questions that have been brought up previously that we haven't got a chance to answer. Feel free to keep typing in questions. I've got another couple of new ones. Natalie, you've heard a theory about kids are more likely to have tantrums in public because they know we are less likely to react as we would at home. I definitely think that's possible, but I put a different spin on it. To say that they know we are less likely to react as we would at home isn't necessarily the case, in that tantrums aren't necessarily on purpose. In fact, usually they're not. The child doesn't have as much control over their behavior as we might think. Even if we notice these kind of patterns where it's like, well, you didn't do this in this situation, you little so-and-so, so I know you're manipulating me or something. That's not a useful way of thinking about, and probably not accurate for most kids. So, but yes, there certainly can be big differences in different settings. That's a very common thing and very worth identifying. That if you can't react the way you would in public, then of course it's harder for you to change that tantrum behavior, so you might get more of it. but also think about how much you can do in public, because you can't, sometimes you can do more than you think. Like you can do an adapted version of timeout in public. You can do consequences like planned ignoring if it's safe to do so. What do you do when your child stops breathing as part of a tantrum, Elisa? To tell you, to be honest, I'm not the world's expert on breath holding. You can get that as part of tantrums and outside of tantrums. I believe it depends a bit on the age of the child in terms of how concerned you should be or what you should do about it. In general, my understanding is it's not such a problem. It's very alarming if you see a child holding their breath for a long time and changing color, but I believe it doesn't actually do any harm or lead to any significant problems, so you can just let it go. But again, I have to confess, I'm not an expert on that. It might be better to check with a GP, or you can look up Raising Children Network. I think there's some good information on breath holding there. I'm just reading some more. Caroline, you had an observation that your child has way more tantrums for your partner and yourself than for babysitters. Is that common or normal? Well, it's not necessarily common, but it certainly can happen, and it's not uncommon. And I guess what that tells you is there's something different about the situations that your child's in when they're with you and your partner compared to babysitters, or something different about those people. You know how we went through that picture of all the different people involved around your child? That's worth thinking about. Is there anything that the babysitters do differently or different about the situation when the babysitters are there? You may be able to use that to your advantage, and particularly depends on what the purposes are for your child's tantrums. So that would be something that you'll need to think through. What is the purpose when my partner and I and you are there compared to when the babysitters are there? Another question that I think was quite a popular one, and this is from last week that Laura brought up around noting that sometimes what she'll tend to do when her 2-year-old throws a tantrum is sit next to her until she calms down and then try to talk to her about it. And Laura's husband felt that that was maybe contributing to the tantrum. I would say, I guess it's possible. It depends on your analysis on what the purpose is. So you think about the whole situation, trigger, behavior, consequence, what time it is, what else is going on around. And it depends on what you're doing while you're sitting there. So if your conclusion is that attention is seeking attention or gaining attention is the purpose of your child's tantrum, then you're going to want to be very careful about sitting next to them, that might be offering them attention, which might be counterproductive. So your husband could be right, but it really depends on your analysis when you go through the whole functional assessment approach. But it's worth thinking about, isn't it? All right, we'll just do one more because we're basically out of time. Thanks for hanging around. Matab, you had a kind of a comment, I think, about your 2-year-old pinching you and Dad when either excited or upset. That's not all that uncommon, so it's not just the tantrum style behavior. You can actually use this approach for things other than tantruming, as we've mentioned in the past. So functional assessment is actually a very powerful approach that you can use for all sorts of behavior, not just tantrums. So you can use functional assessment for pinching behavior, which just means you'd go through the whole trigger behavior consequence approach for working out why the pinching is happening, what the purpose of it is, and then respond accordingly. Try and teach your 2-year-old to do something else instead. So that's a useful question to help us expand our attention to other opportunities. All right, folks, I think we're going to end the session there. You've all done very well concentrating for a whole hour for another week. Good luck. Watch out for the handouts during the week. Make sure you're doing some of those things that we had on that slide early on. Remember this one. You can check that out later in the handout when it comes around. Don't wait till the end of the course to start doing this stuff. And at the start of next session, let us know how you're going. That would be really interesting to hear. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. We'll talk to you next time.